In the last presentation that Fred Kirschman gave, he mentioned one of the places that we have to go in agriculture is to look at things like permaculture. And we have Rob Avis and his wife, Michelle, who come from Calgary and are instructors who talk about permaculture. And it's interesting that both Rob and Michelle came from the oil industry originally and now are on this new venture. And I have taken some permaculture workshops, and I think Rob will be talking about the design going forward for farms and agriculture and communities.
And I want to start with a quote that I recently heard from a colleague of mine who's one of a very well-known, renowned landscape ecologist. And it kind of summarizes a lot of my journey to where I am right now. His name is Brad Stelfox, and he works in Alberta, specifically on human impact. And his comment to me just completely floored me because, we talk a lot in Alberta, and I'm sure in Saskatchewan globally, about the oil sands. And when he said that the oil sands are a drop in the bucket when compared to agriculture from an impact perspective, ecologically, geologically, that completely floored me. So tonight I'm going to talk, this morning I'm going to talk about the future of farming within a permaculture context. And some of you are probably wondering, what the heck is this permaculture thing? I want you to notice that I don't have dreadlocks. I'm wearing a colored shirt. I had a shower within the last week. And I'm going to specifically hit three things. I'm going to talk about the myth of society. This is going to be a journey that I've been on for a while. I'm exploring this concept of myth. I'm going to bring that back into the context of how we're going to actually move society forward. I'm going to talk about the problems that we face. And I'm going to talk about how food production needs to change in order to be sustainable. And some of my talk is a little bit negative, but my promise is that I'm always going to bring it back to solutions. This is a picture of the Middle East, specifically Saudi Arabia. And I was in Jordan last year and at a conference specifically about water. And I think we need to look to places like the Middle East for patterns in human settlement, and specifically patterns that we don't want to follow. This was one of the most fertile places on the planet, and I bet you that if you were able to live in this place when things were being farmed or things were in very, very good condition, and you told them that if we continued down this path, we would end up in a desert, people would laugh at you. So we live in one of the most resource-wealthy countries on the planet, with the most amount of water, the most amount of topsoil. And this idea of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba turning to desert seems so far from reality. It seems laughable almost. But it's totally possible. And if we continue going down the path that we're going to end up here. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about this concept of myth. And actually, before I do that, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Rob Avis. I run Verge Permaculture with my wife, Michelle, in Calgary, Alberta. We're both trained as mechanical engineers. We started our life off, our careers off as oil and gas engineers, working in various oil and gas companies. Specifically, I did facilities engineering, so I was responsible for taking down all those massive swaths of trees to bring pipelines in. And environmentalists believe and talk about having a lack of humans on the planet as a good thing. And I don't believe that at all. But when I was in the oil and gas industry, I was getting ready to take down a massive swath of trees to bring in a new natural gas pipeline. And I said, this feels really wrong. But at the same time, I drove my car here, I choose fossil fuel. I heat my house with natural gas. So how can I discriminate against the very industry that I'm supporting as a consumer? And, the butterfly effect was in full effect that morning because I received a video called Greening the Desert. It was specifically about the Middle East and how one man was able to use some very, very simple principles, just understanding the physics of water, basically, and some biological understanding to reverse the desertification on a very small, insignificant piece of land in the Jordanian Valley, one of the most fertile places on the planet at one point. And I was like, wow, this is what I need to learn about, because here's an example of somebody who's taking all of this his life energy and actually turning it into productive use. So if the most negative thing on the planet is the nuclear bomb, what's the most positive? We don't talk about that very often. So I don't believe humans are inherently destructive, but I believe that it's really important that we understand that myth exists within our society. Because if we don't understand the myth that we're currently living within, or the story, then how can we change it? And I think story it's really important to understand how story kind of ties into this myth. When we think about myth, we think about the Romans and the Greeks, but when people look back on our civilization, they're going to tell stories that come across as things that we believe right now that were absolutely ridiculous. Like glyphosate is good for the soil, or glyphosate is biodegradable. I mean, that could be a myth that could be talked about in 100 years from now, or thousands of years from now. And I think that the only way that we're actually going to be able to change our story, which is absolutely crucial to changing the direction of humanity and culture, is by starting to tell a more positive story, which means that we need to talk about what we're doing right. And the more we talk about what we're doing right, the more we can start changing the course of humanity. And we have to take back that ownership of that story. Right now, that story is owned by corporations, and it's owned by mass media. And most of us know that mass media is controlled by about 3 to 5 corporations on the planet. So these conferences are very, very important places where we can actually start to change the story that we live our life by. So next time you are repeating things that maybe are not as positive as they possibly could be, think about how you can start to change that mythology. So my wife and I traveled around the planet basically trying to find these positive stories, to try and change the programming in our head with regards to how we humans can live on this planet in a positive way. And if I had to define what permaculture actually was, permaculture is a design system based in science, guided by ethics, to the design of sustainable human habitat. And it's based in positivism. So you don't have a slug problem in your garden, you have a duck opportunity. And so one of the myths that we uncovered was this idea that we can't repower the world. We need fossil fuel to power the world, and we're doomed without it. So we might as well become really good bed partners with Shell and Chevron and Esso and all of these companies, because without them we're doomed, because we're useless. We're meaningless, powerless individuals to make change, and we have to rely on them. But we're all debating in this country whether we have enough renewable energy to meet the needs of 35 million people. Denmark's doing it. In fact, they're pretty much there. They've already beat their 2020 targets for solar energy. At times, their grid is 100% wind power. They have the cheapest energy costs in Europe. They're doing it. They've developed the technology. They had a choice in the 1970s whether or not to go to nuclear or whether to go to wind. And wind technology didn't exist, so they invented it. They are the inventors of wind turbines, and they didn't just do it from a corporate perspective. Communities got together and built the wind turbines that were required to repower that country. So all the power in that country was owned by every single individual in that country. So there was never a not in my backyard incident, because when the wind turbines were turning, their bank accounts were all filling up. say that tomorrow from 2:30 to 2:50, it's a fairly short session. I'm going to be in the Innovation Center, and I'll be able to answer questions at an open space, essentially. So people that want to ask me specific questions about permaculture can come at that point and ask me questions then. Next slide, please. So a colleague of mine, Doug Weatherby, soil doctor, Michelle and I bring in international speakers to Calgary to try and, again, change this story to show how we can be just as positive as we are negative. And so Doug Weatherby put this slide together. This doesn't exactly convey that positive thing. We're not to the positive part yet, but so I just want to kind of start these problems so we can get to the solutions. This is basically a chart showing the amount of CO2 emitted by agriculture when compared to the fossil fuel industry. So that's starting from 10,000 years ago. So agriculture, again, like eclipses fossil fuel CO2 through carbon loss in the soil. And this is from Dr. Ratan Rao, Director of Carbon Management and Sequestration Information from his research. So climate change is something that we're going to have to face, whether we like it or not. And I believe that we can have our cake and we can eat it too. I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. Next slide, please. Peak fossil energy. Fred kind of hit on this a few minutes ago. This is kind of one of the first things that got me into